So I thought we would start with Black liberation, Black power.
Okay.
And I was wondering if I could ask you to speak a little bit just about the events and experiences that compelled that work.
Black Theology and Black Power, which was published in 1969, emerged out of the context of the 1960s. I was in Adrian, Michigan, when I wrote that book. And I had just been out of seminary 1 or 2 years. And the civil rights movement was really at its peak. And Black power was just beginning to emerge in 1966 on the James Meredith March. And by a year later, there was a riot in Detroit, about 70 miles from Adrian. And it was July 1967. That event was a turning point in my life. It was happening anyway because I was searching to find my voice in the society, in the civil rights movement, and especially after the rise of Black power in 1966, and also the voice of Malcolm X, which became so dominant after his assassination and death in February 1965. Everybody was saying things like, Christianity is a white man's religion, especially in the Black consciousness movement. And there were Black poets like Sonia Sanchez and Leroy Jones, that movement. And there was Stokely Carmichael and Ralph Brown. And King and the civil rights movement didn't know what to do with them. King was still a Negro, but I was identified with King. So I was a Christian theologian whose heart and head was still with the faith, but the popular manifestation of Black power and the Black consciousness movement was separate from that faith. So I had to find a way to bring together what I felt in my heart and in my head, a unity between Martin and Malcolm, Black power and the civil rights movement. Otherwise, I would split open. It was the challenge of the Detroit riot, where they had pushed King to the side and had affirmed Malcolm X. And at one point they said, "Get out of here, Dr. King. We don't want you here. Bring Malcolm X," even though Malcolm was dead. And I felt it was my theological obligation to say a word about Christianity and Black power. And that's when I sat down and wrote my first essay that was called Christianity and Black Power. And then sat down in the summer of 1968, just after the assassination of Martin King, and wrote Black Theology and Black Power. I wrote that book because I had to. It was trying to make sense out of all of what was happening among young Black people and the Christian faith. and my origin in the South, where that faith was deep in me, my mother and my father, it had given me the strength to be who I am, yet at the same time, this new voice, this new movement captivated me. So, the black and black theology comes from Malcolm X. It is mentioned first because I'm black first, before I was a Christian. And then the theology in black theology comes from Martin King. And that Christian identity I could not let go. So black liberation theology was an attempt to bring together these two political forces within and cultural forces within the black community, religious forces within the black community. And I wrote it because I had to write it. Otherwise, leave the church. Because the movement was so powerful in the late 60s that I could not turn away from it. And that is what led to the writing of the first book.
And can I ask how old you were when you wrote it?
I was 29, 30, right in there. I was born 1938, August, so you can calculate, I was born August 1938, so I would be, and I wrote the book in June 1968, so I was just beginning to turn 30.
Okay. And you mentioned the fact that at the time there were voices critiquing the idea of Christianity as anything other than a white religion.
Yes.
And I'm wondering if the Christianity that emerges in black theology and black power, and that you have continued to articulate since, is it a black Christianity that is fundamentally different than white Christianity? Do you see them as two distinct things?
Yes, absolutely. They are different, absolutely different, because white Christianity is a faith which emerged out of the Western theological religious tradition, largely defined by the dominant people within that tradition. It did not challenge slavery seriously. It did not challenge colonialism. It did not challenge lynching or Jim Crow segregation. And black liberation theology does not believe that you can develop an understanding and meaning of the Christian faith in this America and in this modern world, 20th century, without engaging white supremacy. If you conceive an understanding of Christianity that does not engage white supremacy in America, it cannot possibly be the Christian gospel that emerges out of Jesus of Nazareth, who was nailed to the cross, largely because he comes from a marginalized group that were in a similar situation as African Americans are within this society. So no, white Christianity cannot be Christian. And that's what I said in those books. Black Christianity, insofar as is that it emerged out of a tortured, humiliated culture and sought to speak a word of liberation in spite of its own oppression, coming out of its own reading of Scripture. That itself is much closer to what Jesus was talking about and what Jesus lived and what Jesus preached than anything else I could imagine within America. So, Christianity is a slave religion. And anything that doesn't come from those at the bottom cannot be the Christian faith.
I want to ask about something you just said, which is the fact that Black Christianity comes from the Black community's own reading of Scripture.
Yes.
And I feel like, at least in academic writing, you sort of pioneered the use of non-academic Black voices in informing your theology and your methodology. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit about the struggle to legitimize that sort of source and where you think we are today with the acceptability of that sort of thing.
Well, when I saw that the religion of Jesus, the story, as I saw it told in Black sermons and spirituals and songs and in preaching, when I saw that story about Jesus was much closer to the story I read about Jesus in the New Testament, I saw that anybody who does not read the Jesus story from those at the bottom cannot understand it. They may intellectualize it and tell technical things about when was this written and when was that, but I'm talking about the message of the gospel in that story. Now I said to myself, if I'm going to tell that story, I have to use the language of the people who gave me that insight. And the insight came from my own origin, because while I was in seminary reading commentary, it gave me no clue to this insight. It was when I stopped thinking about them and started thinking about what my people were doing in the streets and where they received that insight from to march and demonstrate and fight for freedom and justice. They created songs in that movement. Songs that emerged from people who were maids and janitors, etc. So I had to look into the story and the religious heritage of Black people, look at the spirituals, look at the slave narratives, look at the preaching during slavery. When I looked at that, then I saw that if I'm going to really understand a message that is so close to the message of Jesus, that story, I got to use that language. I can't simply use academic language as I was taught. And the freedom to do that, for me to do that, freedom for me to do that, came from the conviction inside me to want to bear witness to the people who gave me that insight. And I wanted to, it's their insight. It's not mine. It's theirs. It was given to me. It was bestowed to me. My mother, my father, Macedonia AME Church in Bearden, Arkansas, and First Baptist and all the other, they gave that insight to me. And when I tell them that, they don't know what I'm talking about. But I know what I'm talking about. And Jesus was not an intellectual. He was a peasant. Even biblical scholars say that. He was illiterate. He didn't write anything. He told parables. Now, when I read those parables and I read about him, it's a story very close to slaves. Now, if I'm going to tell that story and link the Jesus story with the black story, I'm going to have to use the language of slaves in my own people's history, the language of maids and janitors, who just from their own existential encounter with the story of Jesus is produced an insight that enabled them to overcome tremendous odds, which they had to fight against. And so fight for dignity. You know, that sense of self, to live under a dominant white supremacist society and yet raise your children, marry, and love your children, and empower them to become somebody like myself. I received that. So I wanted to try to describe the power of their religion, of their story, of their words. So that I didn't care whether people liked it or not. That's what gave me the insight. And the longer I live, the more I am captivated by that insight. That's why I wrote the last book the way I did, Crossing the Lynching Tree. And I still, if I do anything else, I'm thinking about doing a book on James Baldwin now. Oh. Baldwin helps me to take it deeper because he does the same thing. He uses the language of people, church language, poor people's language. And so I'm captivated by Baldwin because he is so spiritual. Mm-hmm. And he was a preacher himself. He said, I left the church to preach the gospel. Mm-hmm. So so that's how I came to use the language. I think the language of the people, I think that message is found in the language, That's why music, blues, jazz, spirituals, that's why the music is so important, because music is one place where we've been most creative. And so that's why I've been free a long time, because when I started writing, I didn't care who liked it. Mm. I really did. And it happened to be at a time which, even people in seminary and the churches had to listen. And I wanted to write it well enough that it would be worthy of the suffering that my people have endured.
Do you care then whether there is enough of a space in academic writing for these voices to also have their fair methodological shake, or is that beyond, let's say, the scope of your mission?
It's beyond the scope of my mission. I maybe some of the students I teach might want to do that. My mission is to give voice to people I grew up with. I have come to love all over the world who are seeking to speak. But especially people from my own history. I want to bear witness to their suffering. And I want my writings to be worthy of the suffering that they had to go through. That's why I try to take as much care as I can with the writing. I don't consider myself a great writer or nothing, because I really could hardly. I went to very poor schools, and it was a struggle for me to get through seminary and graduate school. I learned to write when I did go back there, and I discovered my voice in Black people's history. And I got free enough that I don't care if I don't know them as well as, shall I say, some other theologian. I don't care whether I know Hegel or Barth or Tillich or Luther or Calvin or Augustine as well as they do. I know enough. My creativity is going to come from what I know about my people. And that's what I want to bear witness to.
I want to, if we can, go to something that you just mentioned, which is the suffering that Black people have suffered in America and beyond America for a very long time. And an issue that you address in the second to last chapter of your most recent book, which is the critique of the idea of redemptive suffering.
Yeah.
And one of the things you mention in the chapter on King, if I'm not mistaken, is you talk about the importance of love and the way hate can only beget more hate.
Yes. Right.
And I remember reading that and thinking of Baldwin.
Yes.
Because he has a statement
that's
about
right. That's right.
Hate has a way of destroying everything except the person who hates.
Yeah, that's right.
And I'm wondering if part of your view of redemptive suffering is shaped by the fact that the only alternative might be nothing more than counterproductive hate.
That's right. That's why I like Baldwin and King so much. It's because one is, as I experienced that love in the face of white supremacy, I saw it existentially in my parents. They had no hate. I saw it in my church. They had no hate. We had love for white people too. And we prayed for them in church. And I never heard any expression of hate in the Black community or in my family toward white people. And I felt an affection and a love, not only for each other, but for poor white people who don't know what they're doing. It's like, that's why what Jesus said on the cross, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do, that was the theme in my community, in my church, in my family, in relation to white people. Father, God, forgive them. They don't know what they're doing. And with a sense of humor, we were able to, along with that love, to overcome the hate that was directed at us, which was very clear and very blatant. Baldwin and King embodied and articulated that perspective publicly for the world to see. And that, I saw it in Baldwin's Fire Next Time, especially in a letter to his nephew. Oh, buddy, you gotta love them. Talking to his nephew, James, his namesake. You got to love them. And I saw it in King. It's deep in King. And nonviolence is an expression of that love. And that's why if this society has changed at all, and it has, it's because Black people have been nonviolent. Now we've been more violent against each other than we have been against white people. And I have a student now who's beginning to write about that with James Baldwin on a doctoral exam. He's a white student. And he says it's going to be challenging for me to try to express this sense of love of Baldwin when I'm white, saying black people need to love white people when we have been so vicious? Where do I find the language to stand with Baldwin when I come from a people who have been so brutal and vicious against black people? I'm going to say to them, love my people? That's the challenge he had. Well, Baldwin would like him taking that challenge up. And I appreciated him taking that challenge up because he's going to give that as a public lecture in his doctoral exam in this community, and a lot of black people are going to be there. And they are not going to want to hear any white young man standing up there telling them that they should love white people in spite of the hate that white people direct at them. Well, King and Baldwin, this Black Power movement, did not like it either. And that's why it emerged, because that's their resistance against King. See, the problem with King, problem with loving white people, you can't not forget the fact you got to love yourself in order to do that. If you don't have a healthy respect of yourself, loving the brutal hater, loving the white supremacist, can destroy you as a human being. You got to love yourself first. And Malcolm is indispensable for telling black people what it means to love themselves. That's why I say Malcolm and Martin got to go together. You can't speak of King without also at the same time keeping Malcolm in mind. So that redemptive love is possible, but it has to begin with yourself, And that's why I wrote the book on Martin, Malcolm, and America, is to try to bring those two together. But redemptive suffering is deeply embedded in African American history. And Baldwin and King embodied it and articulated it more powerfully than any other figures I know in our history.
And I'm curious, just going back for a moment to your use of non-academic black voices.
Yes.
Was that part and parcel to that process of loving yourself first? And also I'm curious about the connection between loving yourself first and finding your voice.
Yeah, I would never have found my voice without loving myself and loving the people who made me, who produced me, my mother. And I am so deeply my father and mother are passed on now. But I have always loved them. And I have always loved the church where I came from. I write about Macedonia AME Church all the time. And I write about the community in Bearden, Arkansas. And I write about the black community in general. That was my way of expressing my love for myself. And using their language is a way of expressing my love for myself. I remember I was in Japan with the Korean Christian church in Japan. They had invited me over there and to talk on the church struggling for the liberation of the people. And I'd been over there almost 3 weeks. And then one night, one person, a Korean, asked me, "What is your language?" I said, "I speak English." "No, what is your original language from your people in Africa?" I said, "I don't know." He said, "You don't know? Language is your identity." I said, "Well, my people created a new language out of English. And you can see it in our music. You can see it in our preaching. You can see it in our poetry, our literature. We take this language and we make it our own. We twist it around. We make it speak for us. I wanted to do that for theology because I knew I couldn't speak for my people without doing that. So I wanted to write theology the way Louis Armstrong blew his trumpet, the way Billie Holiday sang straight through. That's what I wanted to do. So it forced me to find a new language for theology. It took me a while to get where I wanted to go, but the cross and lynching tree is the closest I got to that. And more comfortable with what I was saying and how I was saying it, very conscious about the language that I was using. And that was a way of loving myself. And that empowered me, not the book itself, and many people have told me, not to have, just anger, and, because I grew up in that. But I wanted to have the passion that comes from the language of the people that was healing for both black people and white people and any other people who read that book, if they just open up to read it. And I took my time writing it because I wanted to choose my words carefully. I did the best I could.
How long did it take you to write?
Research and writing was about 8 to 10 years. Just the writing of it took about 3 uninterrupted summers. 3 uninterrupted summers. The writing. But I did a lot of research. I read over, there are a lot of books on lynching. It was a flood of books on it. In 1979 is when the historians began. They can tell you names of people and etc. They got the names, they got the places, they tell you where it happened, when it happened. So I read all those books. It's about more than 50 books that I read just on lynching. Then I had to read the history and the story of black people, of white people, and all of that. And then theology, I had to think about the cross in that context. I had to meditate on it. And that led up 5 or 6 years. I gave the first lecture on it at Harvard Divinity School, I think in the year 2005 or something like that. That was my first kind of writing about it. I gave a lecture there, and then the book came out, 2011, I think, or something like that.
I'm curious about the research process,
yes,
especially the period in which you're just sort of immersed in literature on lynching.
Yes.
Because for me, that was the most difficult part of reading this book, was reading those stories and not being overwhelmed by the anger.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious about, especially because the book ends on a hopeful note.
Yes.
I think my biggest question is, how did you pull that off?
Well, there are a lot of horror stories I did not include. And I think what you have to do, I immerse myself in reading all those stories. And there are a lot of them out there. White historians have told the story of lynching. And they've told how it happened and all details about it. And it makes you so angry. I would note the stories, but I just didn't want to put them in there because they were horror stories. I wanted to make a theological point with the story. But I didn't want the terror and the violence and the horror of the story to direct people away from what I was saying. So I had to contain my anger, I had to step back. I evolved and stepped back. Because I grew up in a society. Arkansas was a lynching state. And there was, in 1919, a burst of violence in Lorraine, Arkansas, that killed from 100 to 300 people in just 3 or 4 days. And I read about that. There are 3 or 4 books on that, and I read that. And it's angry. It makes you angry. But I had to pull back, go in, pull back, go in, pull back. And I had a lot of people to read it who would tell me the truth and who would help me to keep the story real and close to me, and not overdo anything and not underdo anything. So I had people to read it. I had some people I trusted to read it who were good writers. I had a great writer, editor at Orbis Book, Robert Ellsberg. He's the editor and publisher of Orbis Book. He worked on that book even during his Christmas holidays. On Christmas Day, he was working, editing my text and sharpening it and adding a word here, taking one out. He did a great job in making it have the power that it's had. And so yes, much due to a good writer, as Baldwin said, has to have a good editor. And Ellsberg was a good editor for me. But then there were others. Colleagues and also friends and ordinary people from my community. And so, I think it was the grace of God. I really do that enabled me to write that book. It's my favorite text. Now, in some sense, all of them. I like Black Theology, Black Power, because that's the first birth of my work. I like the Black Theology of Liberation because that's the first explicit theological expression of my work. I like the Spirituals and the Blues because that's me trying to go into more substantially into the voices of my people. And I like God of the Oppressed because that's doing theologically what I had learned from the Spirituals and the Blues. I like Martin and Malcolm in America because these are the 2 figures that forced me to write what I write, empowered me, gave me the language to write. They were the embodiment of Black and Christian. And then there's Cross and Literature. I really like that one. So it's a gift. I've been lucky. I've been lucky in the sense that I have written books that have had a little staying power. And people in my community still write me daily about those books.
Now I want to talk a little bit about the Black community, and especially in urban environments like the one I cover in Baltimore.
Yeah.
Because I think one of the things that you really run into, especially with younger people,
Yeah.
is an anger that becomes fatalism.
Yeah. I
And
know.
I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to what Black liberation theology says to those young people and what their experiences say to liberation theology.
Yeah. Their experiences are a challenge to Black liberation theology. Because Black liberation theology emerged from a period that they know very little about. And I feel it as a challenge. It was a challenge in the late 1960s to young people and who were in the Black Power movement. They were not Christians. And they challenged me. You know, I try to listen. I try to place myself in a situation to hear their voices from their experience. I don't know whether I have anything to say to them or not that they could hear. I'm not sure. You know, what I would want to say is, don't self-destruct. You need a reason for living. If you don't get that, you will self-destruct. And I don't know that if I have a word that would enable them to pull themselves together the way I came out of Beard Knox. I had a church and a community. They often do not. How can you survive without a community that cares? I don't know whether I have anything to say. It's like, that's why I use music a lot, because I think music speaks when no other language can speak. That's why rap music is so popular among urban Black people. But that is not my music. And I tell my students that they have to learn to speak to that urban community that you're talking about. I'm not sure I do have the word that really speaks to them. I don't know. I'd have to think about that a long, long time. Because, you know, words have meaning from the cultures out of which they come. And I don't know as much about the alienation and the nihilism found in urban communities. So I wouldn't want to give a formula for what I would be able to say about that. You know, I pass on that. Okay.
Well, let me ask a question that is, I think, somewhat in the same vein, which is about the continued relevance of the lynching tree for American society today.
Okay.
Now, in your conclusion, you talk about the criminal justice system.
Yes, I do.
And oftentimes when I've asked people the question, you know, what is the symbol today that is akin to the lynching tree? And this was a question I recall asking some of my Black fellow students while I was here at Union. Because you hadn't written the book yet, but you were starting to articulate its message in your lectures. And they would generally say jail, prison.
Yeah, that's right.
But there have been a number of events that have risen to prominence in the media landscape in
Yes.
the last couple of years.
Yeah, that's right.
Most recently, obviously, Mike Brown,
Mike Brown.
and Ferguson, Trayvon Martin.
Trayvon Martin. Yeah.
And these are the sort of, just to name a few, the ones
Yeah,
that are
that's
still
right.
on the cusp of our lips. And which are both, even though one was committed by a police officer, essentially extrajudicial killings.
Yes, it is.
And so do you see that as something that even beyond just the criminal justice system, which has a sort of overarching structure to support it in place, a fundamental fact still for Black life in America?
Yes, I do. I do. And I think the ones you name, Trayvon Martin, Mike Brown, also Jordan Davis, Therese McBride, these are extrajudicial killings. And what is lynching? Lynching means that Black people have no rights, which Black people are bound to respect. And everybody knows that. So any moment, walking down the street, you can be eliminated by a white person or by a policeman without thought. And that's what the lynching was about. That white people could do anything to you. With the judicial system, in the criminal justice, or outside of it. And today, I do think the criminal justice system in prisons, of course, is a good example. You could, Michelle Alexander's book called The New Lynching or something like that, instead of the new lynching tree or something like that. So it certainly is expressed there, but it's also expressed in these extrajudicial killings on the streets of America, in our communities. And it can have, that's why Black people get so angry. It's not the number of lynchings that upset you. It's the terror that knowing that they can happen anytime, any moment, and most Black people know it. And the ones who don't know it, usually that's what happens to them. And so, yeah, I see a strong connection between the Trayvon Martin killing and the Mike Brown execution. Yeah, I do. That's what I mean by the lynching tree. And I think most people made that kind of connection.
Do you think that fundamentally the fight is still about establishing even the possibility of Black subjectivity in America?
Yeah. I don't know whether the country is going to embrace that, but I think Black people have to embrace it. And I think we have to be clear that we are more than what the society says that we are, and we have to express that. And my work has been all about that. And I've tried to sustain it for over 4 decades. And it has not been easy at Union and in the world. But I'm a theologian committed to writing theology for my people, in order to express that Black subjectivity.
And then I want to ask a related question, which is, one of the things that is mentioned oftentimes in the book is the idea of redeeming the soul of America.
Yes.
And I suppose we might say white America. Is that fair?
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about your view of the project and where it stands?
I don't know. I've been at that a long time, and I've been at a religious institution like Union, where the best of white people are. I think King was more confident about that, redeeming the soul of white America, than I am. But I cannot lose hope, because, as my mother always said, and the people in Macedonia said, God works in mysterious ways. And we cannot say what God cannot do and what transformation God cannot make or redeem. No one is outside of the possibility of redemption. So the question I have to ask, do I bear witness to the meaning of redemption in such a way that others can be redeemed by my witness? So the question comes back to me, not to them. And I keep trying, and I keep praying.
I'm curious about that, because it does seem like oftentimes it falls to Black persons, the responsibility to fix a white problem.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. That's what it means to follow Jesus of Nazareth. That's what Baldwin meant by loving white people. That's what King meant by loving the enemy. And that's what he meant by redemptive suffering. Who's redeemed are the people who do the suffering. That is, the people who do it and the people who are the victims of it. That's who's redeemed. Yes, I think the Christian faith is a faith that lays that burden on Black people to redeem this country. Now, a lot of Black people do not like that. Why us? Why is the burden placed on us? Why not white people? I don't know. But I firmly believe that it's placed on us. I don't think white people will ever see it. I don't think they ever will. And, as I said, and I really do mean that, I'd much rather be a part of African American history than white history. I'd rather be a part of the people who have been resisting and creating a vision of humanity about love and justice. I'd much rather be a Nelson Mandela or Desmond Tutu than a part of the apartheid system that tried to kill him. So I'd much rather be a part of Black people, such as King, Malcolm, that history, than a part of the history of lynching, people who lynch people. I don't want to be that. So if being a part of that history means I got to love the lyncher, yeah, I do that. I don't want to hate people who were lynched. I don't want to be a part of a hating group. So I say, for my own humanity, I carry that burden. And that's what the song, that's what King meant by the song, Must Jesus Bear the Cross Alone. That's what King meant. And all the words, no, I got to bear it too.